Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating, honestly pretty bold new paradigm proposed by Kyle MacLean Smith. It's all about societal healing and gender dynamics, but it challenges a ton of our current cultural assumptions by pivoting hard toward radical personal responsibility. Let's kick things off with this quote right here from Smith, because it perfectly sets the stakes for us. Hurt people, and it's compounding. He points to a massive failure in how we handle relationship breakdowns, specifically calling out a divorce industrial complex. Basically, our legal systems are often amplifying conflict instead of resolving it. And his argument? Until we actually address this institutionalized compounding trauma, literally everything else we try to fix in society is going to be an uphill battle. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, diagnosing cycles of abuse. Second, the fifth wave proposition. Third, swapping roles in shadow work. And finally, achieving pro-social harmony. All right, Section 1, diagnosing cycles of abuse. We're looking at systemic trauma and the evasion of responsibility. So Kyle outlines this really broad scope of abuses where accountability is just completely evaded. He's deeply frustrated with a legal system that he feels strips people of their autonomy, especially in family law. But, it goes way beyond just institutions. He points out spiritual abuse, like the dangerous misuse of plant medicine in unregulated communities. He even gets into interpersonal manipulation, giving the specific example of how music can actually be weaponized in social settings to coerce consent and undermine relationships. The big common thread? Evading accountability, top to bottom. The framework traces all this evasion back to an archetypal block called arrested development. This is where unresolved generational trauma creates these highly competitive rather than nurturing family dynamics. Smith brings up the mythological figure of Saturn, the cannibal father, who views the younger generation as direct competition. Think of it like a toxic boss who sabotages their best employee because they're terrified of being replaced, instead of, actually mentoring them. It's a lack of unconditional support that just keeps the trauma loop going. Now, the absolutely crucial point here is what happens when we don't know how to process all this. Kyle argues that modern society just fails to train us in emotional attunement. So when our anger and our boundaries get suppressed, they don't just vanish into thin air. They turn into what he calls leaky energy. And that festering anger bleeds out into our relationships in totally toxic, destructive ways, which, you guessed it, just compounds that cycle of abuse. Okay, moving right along to Section 2, the fifth wave proposition, moving toward Maslow's higher order needs. Here's where it gets really interesting. The framework actually redefines fifth wave feminism. It's not framed as a political movement, but rather as a philosophy strictly focused on deep, personal accountability for all genders. Smith acknowledges that past feminist waves rightly focused on beating systemic oppression, but for us to have a truly high-functioning society today, this proposed fifth wave demands that both men and women stop playing the blame game, end the cycle of systemic blame, and actually hold themselves accountable for their own actions and healing. To put that into perspective, the proposition suggests we need to step up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. While those earlier movements were completely vital for securing basic survival and autonomy against oppressive systems, the fifth wave is all about self-actualization. Once we've got that baseline autonomy, the next evolutionary step is rigorous personal accountability. We're not just looking for basic survival anymore. We are striving for absolute personal accountability to meet our higher-order emotional needs. Simple, right? So, what you really need to take away from this is the profound shift in agency. We heal the collective by first taking radical responsibility for the self. Kyle comes down hard on the modern tendency towards solipsism, which in this context is a dangerous kind of self-centeredness, where someone is totally blind to the harm they're causing others. To fight this, the fifth wave demands self-contained integrity. That means no more leaky energy, no more blaming the system or the opposite sex. You just completely own your actions. Which brings us to Section 3, swapping roles in shadow work, exploring new frontiers in psychological healing. Before we get into the specifics, let's just make sure we're on the same page about shadow work. This is the psychological practice of confronting and integrating our darkest, suppressed traits. The messy, uncomfortable parts of ourselves that we really don't want to admit are there. Doing this is absolutely essential if we ever want to achieve that self-contained integrity we were just talking about. Now, here is where Kyle proposes a pretty fascinating role swap. He argues that while past feminism really helped women overcome self-hatred, men are now the ones deeply struggling with it. So the focus has to shift. He asks men to pivot their shadow work toward healing their self-hatred, fixing those father wounds, and breaking out of their historical cycles of war and conflict. On the flip side, the framework asks women to confront their suppressed capacities for harm, what it starkly labels as murderous intent, and to escape that solipsism of thinking they're somehow incapable of perpetrating abuse. This quote right here perfectly encapsulates the whole proposition. Perhaps we switch roles in our shadow work. Now we do the shadow work of not self-hating, and you'll do the shadow work on murderous intent. It's asking both sides to face the shadows they've historically ignored by having men tackle self-hatred and women acknowledge their own capacity for real relational violence. Smith posits that we can actually reach a much more honest, balanced baseline for human interaction. Let's head into our final section, Section 4, Achieving Pro-Social Harmony. This is about synthesizing individual healing into broader societal health. Looking at this comparison, the overarching synthesis gets really clear. We are trying to move from a reactive society, one that's plagued by leaky boundaries, weaponized relationships, and systemic blame, straight into pro-social harmony. This new state relies entirely on self-contained energy, where we express our emotions cleanly without manipulating people. Consent is completely restored and respected, and the whole thing rests on the bedrock of individual accountability. It's a bit of a paradox, but strict individual boundaries are exactly what create a safe, harmonious society. So these 4 pillars summarize the ultimate goal here. First, it's about reclaiming both masculine and feminine integrity, not demonizing one over the other. Second, establishing incredibly strict, healthy emotional boundaries to stop that leaky energy. Third, replacing those destructive cannibal archetypes we talked about earlier with the eternal loving father and mother, foundations built on unconditional support, not competition. And finally, cultivating thriving, sustainable family structures, which Kyle views as the actual bedrock of a healthy civilization. The big takeaway? Individual accountability is the ultimate icebreaker for societal healing. By just refusing to pass on the trauma, you break the ice. Smith argues that waiting around for the legal system or culture at large to magically fix itself is just a lost cause. But if even one individual or one family refuses to participate in that cycle of abuse, they create this wild patch of innovation and healing that others can actually trace and follow. This framework definitely presents a challenging, intensive roadmap, demanding that we look inward at our darkest traits to heal the whole. So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. Can embracing radical personal accountability and swapping roles in our shadow work actually be the key to finally breaking the cycle of societal abuse?